The Labour Party has pledged in one of its 5 missions, it has put ending incidences of men's violence against women at the very, very heart of what it does. There is so little attention on the single biggest violent crime type in our country from a political class. Women as a sex class of women absolutely being used as a weapon in the conflict in Israel.
The issue of surrogacy goes to the heart of equality for women and girls. Seeing women and girls as human beings, not body parts to be rented out, our reproductive capabilities commodified.
I see how sex and women's oppression as a sex class impacts on some of the biggest and most complex areas of public policy, including the criminal justice system and the immigration system as well. Labour has to take on the pimps and the pornographers. If we're really serious, I personally believe it's imperative that we criminalise pimping websites and paying for sex, decriminalise individuals who sell sex, and instead provide them with support and exiting services. To end the trafficking and sexual exploitation of women and girls, we must end the demand for it. And on pornography, which is filmed prostitution, Labour must crack down on the rampant abuses and harms of this trade. At a bare minimum, we must force pornography websites to verify the age and consent of every individual who features in pornography on their platform, give individuals in pornography the legal right to withdraw their consent at any time, and at any time to that content remaining online, and address pornography in legislation and policy as a form of violence against women and girls, because that is what it is. Courage calls to courage everywhere, and its voice cannot be denied.
Women's sports people might have to compete against someone born a man who may have used some drugs to be able to compete as a woman is quite extraordinary. And yes, our bodies are different from men's. You know, I think we've got rather good bodies ourselves. But you know, let's run our own races and leave them to run theirs. You know, let's stop this nonsense that there are certain men who can compete against women. There should be no men on women's wards. My granddaughter swims in a polo team. I mean, I don't want her changing and finding a man walking into her changing rooms. Is that too much to ask? Not a pretty sight, and they shouldn't be there. So, no to any of that, and no to having, without their permission, any of our disabled or any other women in hospital or at home having intimate care from somebody now. Because we will be like Putin's Russia, or we will be about Iran, if we are shutting down the ability for, or hounding women for saying biological men are not biological women. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. Now, I can't believe there is anyone who doesn't want to believe that there are men and there are women and they're two different categories.
This is about the importance of single-sex spaces, particularly for women survivors of men's violence.
Sex equality is not possible when one sex is for sale, when women are a commodity and the other sex is the vendor and the buyer, with consumer rights, of course.
The next hill I'm going to die on, and quite possibly literally, is probably Lexi's campaign about surrogacy. It's another way of erasing women and erasing mothers and just erasing our rights to our bodies.
Last year we had a by-election in a really working class area. So many women there who work in very low paid jobs, absolutely desperate for a Labour council, for a Labour government. And the first thing the Tories did at the start of that by-election was put out social media saying, why should women vote Labour when they're referred to as people with a cervix? And that gained so much traction around that estate and around the local social media circles. And we lost that seat.
Labour Women's Declaration, the women on this panel, the people in this room have helped the Labour Party to shift into the right place, to put self-ID in the bin.
It is our privilege and our responsibility to weigh up different groups' rights, needs, interests and demands as we debate and amend the laws of this land.
If you talk to ordinary people, and elected politicians do so most days, they will tell you that women as a group need protection in law, and trans women also need protection. But these are not the same groups, and this was recognised in the Equality Act when it was legislated. And it's a law that protects against sex discrimination and against transgender discrimination separately, because these are not the same thing. We need to be able to monitor sex discrimination and provide for the needs of women and girls, particularly when they are most vulnerable. People have become terrified to even talk about women's rights. So many women and men write to me to say thank you, and many who've written to say that they're frightened to speak up for women's rights. These include women and men who work in jobs where it's extremely important that they are able to be clear about the difference between male and female and about who women and who men are. These can be jobs that involve safeguarding children, head teachers, social workers. They include people who work in healthcare, nurses told that they should ensure that hospital accommodation is in single-sex bays for men and women, but also that they should allow people to choose which sex they want to be housed as. Women who work in domestic violence shelters who are terrified of being sued or losing their jobs if they make clear that these are female-only spaces. Female athletes who want their sports to be fair but are afraid to speak up because of the response that they'll get. The Equality Act also meant to ensure that organisations should treat trans people fairly and with sensitivity as employees and customers. But this did not mean requiring other people to pretend that they believe that being trans, for example, someone who's born male and perhaps changes their name, their clothes, who might take hormones or even have some physical surgery, is the same as being a woman.
Sex and gender are different. I've never met a trans person who denied this or over the years of having very robust debates with them. And in my life, the discrimination I have suffered at the hands of establishments rather than just, your everyday sexism has always been exclusively because of my biology. The obvious examples I could give are about pregnancy, where I was told not to bother to turn up for interviews because of pregnancy scan appointments. My biology really matters to me, and I have been treated poorly because of it. My remarks are going to be about the issue of single-sex spaces and the safety of women. Women need to be able to have separate services and associations, charities and sports. I am seeing again and again already, this is happening, where specialist women's services are being decommissioned in favour of generic support services that have an all-or-nothing approach. They were expected to support men's services as well. And so they're decommissioning services, and you have situations where perpetrator and victim are in the same service, and that is happening all across the country. It is utterly devastating.
Why did I get interested in this topic? J.K. Rowling said, people who menstruate, wasn't there a word for this? What was it? Oh no, it was woman, wasn't it? Woman. And the very people who she'd made multimillionaires of and whose careers she'd had fostered then turned on her and accused her of being transphobic. Now this lies at the heart of some of this debate. If you assert that there is a biological identity of people, of male and female, then you are liable to be accused of transphobia. Actually, it hasn't happened to me. The people who get accused of it are mainly women. And the groups that concern me are obviously children and women. And it's women's safe spaces that have been put at risk time and time again. They've done this, whether it's been in hospitals, and mental hospitals, whether it's been women's refuges. There'd been real risk. Transgender woman who'd already been convicted of sexual crimes managed to persuade prison authorities and then raped a woman in the prison. Nicola Sturgeon's response, well, that's just one incident. One incident. There have been other incidents. So this is not some marginal issue. And I would tell you something else about this that you may not be. This is a cult. It really is a cult, and it has invaded government departments, it's invaded the BBC, it's there. It'll be interesting in 10 years' time whether or not people will hold these extreme views that are being held today. If you look at what happened in the Tavistock Clinic, which was an absolute travesty, significant numbers of people who were being dealt with puberty blockers were actually on the autistic spectrum and needed very careful handling. We saw a massive increase in young girls who decided that they were suffering from being in the wrong body. If you talk to clinicians who know about this, they'll tell you that was social media had a huge impact on that. So we really need to be careful of how we proceed in this area.
Here we are at risk of legislating for a piece of biology that we really don't understand. We don't even have the figures of knowing how common this really is. We don't even know the follow-up. None of the papers that really have looked at the incidents have followed up patients for long enough to fairly get a clear-eye view of what's really needed. What we might want to do is to call for research.
I'm worried about children and young people. I certainly support the outlawing of conversion therapy with regard to sexual orientation, and I'm respectful of trans people whose lives are greatly improved by their change in gender. However, there are major risks affecting transgender issues in relation to young people. We're not talking about a way of life or sexual preferences, but serious, potential, life-altering medical or surgical intervention. Our former colleague, Baroness Ruth Rendell, campaigned against female genital mutilation and helped introduce laws that made it an offence to send a child abroad for this procedure. I wonder what she would have thought about prescribing pills to a 16-year-old, which could lead to infertility, loss of sexual function, and physical complications, without very thorough advice and counselling. And at an age where the decision to end the possibility of childbearing is surely too young. Puberty blockers, which are given off licence, they've not been licensed for transitioning children. They're the same drug as we use for chemical castration. This bill risks criminalising any psychiatrist, therapist, teacher, doctor, perhaps a parent or a church minister who seeks to engage with that youngster and test their request to transition. Is it not a duty on any surgeon or prescribing medic to be absolutely sure the young person really understands all the consequences of such a life-changing and irreversible medical interaction before they simply affirmed and assented to the patient's request? There is, of course, an interesting question as to whether this bill only covers discussions about a discussion about whether the patient is certain they want to make a change. What about the discussions the other way, the automatic gender-affirming treatments, which come close to persuading someone they want to transition? Perhaps it's those therapists who are engaging in conversion therapy, albeit directing someone to transition as a way of resolving unhappiness or dissatisfaction in their current life, or mere confusion because they are still very young. That's not neutral exploration. It's one-way advice. It says, this is the answer to your problems. Sometimes it is. But the idea that we criminalise discussion, which explores the reason for the desire for change, and which checks that the young person fully understands the impact of physical change, possible, probable loss of childbearing and sexual function, probably before they've even enjoyed good sex. Now that is ludicrous. Informed consent, especially at 16, needs complete understanding. 16-year-olds can't vote. They can't have a tattoo until they're 18. They can't marry until they're 18. So while we believe that marriage, which can be undone, we've already had examples of that, can't take place until they're 18, we seem content for a 16-year-old to risk their future without the benefit of talking therapy to ensure they understand the risks. My friend's daughter started hormone treatment at 16. Within months, her voice had broken, and she will have a man's voice now for the rest of her life. from age 16. So apart from final consent, a nurse-led virtual consultation is all that is necessary for that agency for potential life-altering, irreversible medical intervention likely to lead to infertility. It is this unquestioning affirmative approach which is not open-minded, and it's at odds with standard practice in all other clinical encounters. That this bill will outlaw anything other than unquestioning affirmative treatment.